From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Dan O'Brien talking about the surge in grain prices following the USDA's crop acreage report earlier this week. And Dan will discuss the weather dynamics that have captured most of the market attention of late during Dan's weekly commentary on the grain market trends. Also today, K-State's Sarah Lancaster goes over several herbicide recommendations for weed control in double-cropped soybeans and grain sorghum following wheat. Also today's Kansas wheat harvest update, this time from Extension Agricultural Agent Chris Long of the Walnut Creek Extension District in west central Kansas. And along to talk Kansas agricultural weather with us, of course, K-State's Mary Knapp. It's all here on Agriculture Today. Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Thanks for listening in on this Friday. Well, the USDA on Wednesday provided what could fairly be called a stem winder of a report on the crop acreage. The markets certainly reacted to the new numbers, and we'll talk about that and other grain market factors now with Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. So, Dan, the corn and soybean numbers, planted acres, as the USDA saw them, fell quite short of expectations, and that set the market afire, for a short time anyway.
When you look at the closes on the day that report was released, which would have been Wednesday the 30th. Of course, the July contract's a lead contract, and as of now, it's in the delivery period, but it was just on the verge of, or starting to do that. So it went up 25 cents a bushel. Then you had lock limit up 40 cents a bushel for the September 21 through May 22 contracts. So tremendous rally in the corn market on the future side. And then for soybeans, hanging around 90 and a quarter, up for July, August, September, in the 80s, 83, 86 cent rise in the November and January timeframes, and then 60 and 70 from there. Even wheat got into the act, probably pulled up some by what was happening in the other two crops, especially for corn, up 31, 32 cents on that day. Since that day, when we look at the day after closes, there was some follow through. The September contract closed at $5.99 and a quarter. We didn't end up and lose a whole bunch that next day. We basically closed at $6.01 and three quarters. So there was enough there that people didn't have regret and just bail out on the next day. And the close on soybeans, again, $14.30 for the August contract, now the lead that prices are based off of. We end up and close at just essentially the same number the day after. For wheat, interesting, we did jump up on wheat on September to $6.79 and a half, and then have lost some, down to about 20 cents. But you know what? The way I look at this type of volatility, you and I have talked about this, and that at these lofty price levels, if you look at the percentage change, that a 5% change is at $4 wheat as opposed to what a 5% change is at $6.38. Well, you start to get a perspective and picture on that. Right now, what's 5 cents? You know, that's just noise in the market. Whereas here we dropped 20 cents and gosh, harvest pressures and all that, we're still hanging around $6.38. It is noteworthy to me that really hard to find any carrying charges in the corn complex or soybean complex, but here in the wheat complex, we have storage type charges running from the September through December, March and May contracts. Well, at least through March, 3 to 3.5, 3 3/4 cents. So I'm not quite sure what that's saying, other than we have a new crop that's come in, and the market's recognizing that there's some need for a storage function to go on. So that's probably the result of the harvest being here.
Well, if you would, and you've outlined it fully, as you always do in your weekly notes, Dan, give us a glance at the cash trade around Kansas at the various key delivery points and how prices are matching up there.
When you look at the cash prices for, again, Colby, Salina, Topeka, Garden City, Hutchinson, and Columbus, and look at the very top bids. And sometimes those top bids can be deceptive. For instance, in the major train rail markets, say Topeka, Hutchinson, and in particular, you'll see one or two bids, and maybe Salina, really standing out, X number of cents above others. And that's what we have here. But you'll see the bulk of a lot of other bids 20, 30 cents below that. So if somebody's filling a train or has some type of contractual arrangement they're trying to get. But all that said, let me just read across the spot prices right now for corn and sorghum. So in Colby, corn price $7.05, sorghum price $6.95. Salina $6.62 for corn, $6.78 for sorghum. So a little hotter use of sorghum in an export market. Topeka $6.95, corn $6.75, sorghum. Garden City $6.77, corn $6.52, sorghum. Hutchinson $7.20, corn $7.40, sorghum. Again, you'd expect that's looking towards an export situation. And Columbus $7.63, corn $7.80, grain sorghum. So I don't know if that's export so much, only as much as you'd call export from southeast Kansas down into the livestock areas, the feeding areas to the southeast of that. One thing that's noticeable there is that the southwest Kansas market, which in most cases top, with all the demand down there, really leading the state. Well, in this case, it's just among the pack, with the 4 out of the 5 other areas having higher prices. That's happening in the midst of wheat harvest going on down there. So I don't have a model to say exactly what's going on, but when you wonder why the southwest Kansas market might be a little bit softer for the feed grains than it had been, the only thing that's changed is that we now have wheat to deal with, and maybe that's taking some of the extreme tightness of grain supplies away from some of the feeding. I want to add in too. So we're looking at harvest and what's all happened there. The outside factor that's come in and affected markets this week has been the frost risk in Brazil. We remember they planted that crop late. They thought, well, it'll be no problem. We'll get through it, et cetera. The soybean harvest was late. That delayed everything. And for planting their second crop corn, they got that thing in again later, and now they've had ongoing frost damage to that crop. So all these are setting up for strong support for the feed grain markets. And I'll just throw one other thing in, Eric. I'm just kind of on a roll here this morning. But you look at the weather map of the United States, and we have that in our supporting information. You see a band for 7-day accumulated rainfall running basically from New Mexico, Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma, including parts of Kansas, but running from there up into Wisconsin. Very wet, big rains, but you see dryness on both sides of that. Still dry in good parts of Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and of course, really rough off in the Pacific Northwest. So now we've got that quarterly grain stocks report that said that, we had lower than expected corn stocks and a little bit lower than expected soybean stocks, even a little bit lower than expected wheat. So we've got tighter stocks, which means we had a little better usage, probably feed usage than we had expected. And you bring that into the upcoming July WASDE report, that's probably going to expand usage some, at least for the feed side. So that's on the old crop usage side. That in itself would tighten up ending stocks. And ending stocks this marketing year, beginning stocks for the next. And then you add on top of that, that's the USDA numbers for the planted acres for corn, 92.7 million acres, below 93.8. Well, basically 1.1 and change million acres less than that. And you got dryness in different parts, moisture, if not excess moisture in others. I think it just puts laser focus for the corn market on what that yield is going to be. So is that 179.5 bushels per acre that USDA projected early on as kind of a placeholder saying, hey, we needed that to basically balance the balance sheet. Now we thought, well, that is kind of what it is. We'll see how it works out now. So we don't have such tightness that we damage the usage industries. We'd be hoping we'd get that. So for corn, we've got I was thinking, we look back on the memorable years that we've that we have, the 1988s, the 2012s, the 1993s, as I remember it. Some of those are floods, some of those are droughts. This is a year like that.
Yeah.
It's that much uncertainty, and we'll see where we end up.
No doubt we'll have weather markets galore here as we move forward. Just one quick thing here, Dan. We just, again, don't see signals of serious weakening of wheat prices whatsoever as harvest is pushing into, well, the latter half, at least here in the state of Kansas. Producers, being perhaps skeptics, have to wonder, will the other shoe fall at some point? It just doesn't seem like that's in the cards when one reads the tea leaves, if you will, on stocks and so forth.
I think the situation up in the hard red spring wheat country is affecting the overall wheat balance sheet. And they're dry as all get out. Our former colleague, Bill Tierney, has been with an independent company, has been reporting diligently on how damaging dry conditions are up in Canada. So that same spring wheat production area geographically, it extends from parts of South Dakota, particularly North Dakota, over into Montana, where white wheat's getting involved, and going up into Canada. Tough dry conditions up in those areas, and it'll make for where it's a little drier, perhaps decent proteins, but boy, the quantities sure look to be damaged. Boy, if anybody has wheat of good protein, that could be a valuable commodity, all right.
Dan, thanks as always.
Thank you, Eric. Take care.
His weekly grain market analysis and comment. Dan O'Brien is a grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. Check out his weekly notes on the trades at agmanager.info. And we'll be back in a moment on Agriculture Today. We're back now on this Agriculture Today. Once more, as wheat harvest pushes forward in Kansas, more than a few of you producers out there are either entertaining or involved in double cropping, either soybeans or grain sorghum after your wheat. And there are, of course, a multitude of considerations there. One of them is the weed control program you'll employ for those double crops. We bring by once more weed management specialist Sarah Lancaster of K-State Research and Extension for some thoughts on what to keep in mind there and some options to consider here, Sarah. But something that's pretty important at the outset here, if a producer is following wheat with a double crop, the herbicide program that was in place for that wheat needs to be contemplated too.
That's right, Eric. You know, a lot of the herbicides that we use in our wheat programs are in that ALS inhibiting family, and those products tend to, especially in soils with high pH, have some pretty long rotation intervals, particularly to soybeans. So some things to keep in mind. Ally, metsulfuron-containing products, can have a long rotation interval in some situations. Other things like Rave, one of the components of Rave, can stick around for a while and lead to some longer rotation intervals to soybeans. Generally speaking, those rotation intervals are longer for soybean than grain sorghum. But again, it depends on the product that you used, and a lot of it has to do with the soil conditions in your field. And so it's going to be really important for folks to pay attention to those product labels for the things they used in their wheat to make sure that they're not going to have potential problems with their soybeans or grain sorghum.
In numbers of days, is there a general range for that waiting interval?
You know, the minimum is about 120 days. And so theoretically, that in and of itself is not a problem. But where we get into some of these higher pH soils, we can have intervals up to 3 years for some of these products. So just something to be aware of. And I guess the other thing to say there is if you have access to soybean varieties that are resistant to imidazolinone and sulfonylurea herbicides, you can shorten some of those intervals. But again, it goes back to all of the nuance of the label of the specific product that you used.
As far, though, Sarah, as weed control itself for double crop soybeans now, what are some of the prime considerations?
So, you know, once we remove that wheat and take away that wheat canopy that was so competitive with the weeds, you have a big flush, right? Especially we've had some rains across much of the state this week and temperatures in the mid to upper 80s, prime growing conditions for a lot of our weeds. And so we're going to have some actively growing weeds out there. So folks are going to want to make sure they come in with something that has some contact activity to control those weeds that are already up, as well as a residual herbicide, right? I mean, we all know the name of the game with double cropping is low input, right? We're trying to extract what we can, kind of get a little bit of bonus there. And so, things to think about would be, again, those glyphosate-based programs, but coming in with something to deal with glyphosate-resistant weeds. So we can do things like that. 2,4-D is not uncommon for that purpose. You got to watch, unless you're going with Enlist soybeans and using Enlist 1, according to the labels, you need to watch the plant back intervals there if you go with 2,4-D. But yeah, using something that will give you some burn down activity as well as some residual is going to be important.
And you're going to have to jump on that quickly, is what you're saying, before weeds start to really compete with those fledgling soybean plants.
That's right. I mean, you could potentially be going into a situation where you're planting beans into Palmer amaranth that is much larger than your soybeans.
So get after that, and hopefully the soybean canopy will grow sufficiently to allow one to make this a one-time pass, Sarah.
That's right. That's the goal. Post-emergent options in double crop soybeans are going to be relatively limited. If you've used an Enlist or an Extend Flex variety, you're going to be looking at Liberty-based herbicide applications probably, or glyphosate-based herbicide applications, because we have to give the friendly reminder, Eric, it's July. Right. And so over-the-top applications of dicamba are no longer legal on Extend Flex or Extend soybeans in Kansas.
As far as weed control and double-cropped grain sorghum here, what weeds, Sarah, would one be going after here?
The usual suspects. We've got our Palmer amaranth, potentially our kochia, but also we need to think about grass control, right? So controlling grasses post-emergence in grain sorghum has historically been a weak spot. We are starting to see some of those herbicide-resistant varieties that could give us some help in that regard. But, with grain sorghum, one of the keys to success is a good pre-emergence herbicide program, no matter what you're doing there in terms of your trait selection. And so things to think about would be atrazine. Atrazine is a standard for our grain sorghum and corn programs. And then some of those Group 15 products, so things like Dual or Outlook, herbicides that are based on metolachlor, dimethenamide, or acetochlor.
What about those herbicide-resistant sorghum lines that one might have employed?
In this case, the eye-growth grain sorghums, Eric, and coming in with a pre-emergent application of about 9 ounces of Emiflex herbicide can help you control a lot of those grasses. If you're in an area where things like sandburrs, foxtails are an issue for you, that could be not a bad plan if you have access to eye-growth grain sorghum hybrids. The thing to think about there is making sure you're using that full labeled rate. And again, like we talked about with the soybeans, coming in with a tank mix partner that is going to give you some broad spectrum burn down to control anything that's come up since you've harvested the weeds.
Sarah, briefly moving beyond sorghum or soybeans double crop, such things as cover crops. Weed control there is a different tale?
Weed control with cover cropping is a different tale. That's a good way to say that, Eric. We don't have a lot of labeled herbicide options for weed control specifically in cover crops. Depending on the cover crop species that you choose, we may have some options because that cover crop also is used in other ways. But, thinking about summer covers, they can help with some of that weed suppression. I don't want to step too much on Dr. Tomlinson or Dr. Presley's toes, but, they can also be good for grazing purposes, and they have all of those environmental benefits as well that folks think about.
Yeah, so. If you're sowing a cover crop, you need to study that very carefully as far as your weed control approach in getting that crop off and going. We're talking about double cropping here, Sarah, but it's appropriate as well to address those situations where wheat stubble will remain uncropped for a while. You are urging producers post-harvest to get right after their weed control there.
That's right, Eric. We've touched on the fact that conditions right now are great for weed growth. We've had some rain. We've got nice warm temperatures. So those weeds are going to be growing very quickly. So we can use that to our advantage to some extent, because that means that after we've chopped off those weeds with our combine, they're going to develop some new growth quickly that will be able to take in that herbicide and make for effective herbicide applications. The thing to think about there is, how do we manage those multiple flushes of weeds that are going to come through in those fallow fields? And so thinking about what kind of residual program you're going to use is going to be a key factor there. So, some of the products that we typically think about there again would be, we've mentioned atrazine earlier. That can be useful depending on your rotation. Metribuzin might be useful. And then, we think a lot about controlling the weeds that are existing, right? And so historically, that would have been a Roundup-based program, and Roundup is still going to be a component here, potentially Roundup 240, but also thinking about some of the other products you might want to consider for burn down activity. Valor is probably not a bad plan. Again, thinking about crop rotation restrictions and things of that nature, what you plan to come back with. But Valor is relatively inexpensive. You can adjust your rate to get your crop rotation set a little bit. It has some burn down activity, especially if you apply it with a surfactant system like crop oil. And it also has a little bit of residual activity. And so it can be a good piece, I think, in some of these fallow systems because of the price point and because of what it brings to the table as a herbicide.
And at what point does a grower start to think about volunteer wheat control? And saying that because there may be even more volunteer out there. Producers cranked up their fans to get away from head scab issues in their harvested wheat.
Yeah, so, I guess maybe thinking about volunteer wheat in the summer of 2021 versus the summer of 2020, we may be a little bit better off in the sense that we are getting some rains, and so we are going to see that wheat emerge and be a little bit easier to kind of get a handle on. Atrazine's going to help you there. Your glyphosate is a good component there. You can also think about those grass-controlling herbicides, things like clethodim or select. But again, those are only going to go after grasses. And there are some compatibility issues in terms of antagonism of those products when we start to put them in the tank with a lot of other things.
Well, producers, be strategic as you piece together your post-wheat harvest herbicide programs, either for double crop soybeans or grain sorghum, or, again, if that ground is going to lay fallow until next planting season for weed control in general. Sarah, as always, we appreciate the comments and the information. Many thanks.
Thanks, Eric.
Weed control specialist with K-State Research and Extension, that's Sarah Lancaster on this part of Agriculture Today, here on the K-State Radio Network. Agriculture Today continues now on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you, and for today's wheat harvest update, we'll catch up on progress in west central Kansas and more directly the Walnut Creek Extension District. That is comprised of Lane, Ness, and Rush counties. The agricultural agent there is Chris Long. Chris, by the sound of it, your producers the last 24 hours or so have been slowed by wet conditions.
Yeah, and it's kind of so far been the story of this year's harvest or harvest of 2021. It's they can get going for a few days, get a little bit, and then they get a little bit of rain. And here in the last 28 hours or so, maybe longer for some, we had some fair amounts of moisture fall throughout the area, so it's really hampered them and slowed them down considerably here in the last day and a half or so.
Given that, how far along do you think you are with harvest in a percentage?
Oh, percentage-wise, I would say we're probably nearing maybe 40% across the district. I know there's a few folks that are very close to wrapping up, but there's others that are barely getting started, and then you've got the gamut in between. So about 40% is going to be my best estimate anyway, and I know there's some areas that are a little further along than that across the district, but district as a whole, like I said, about the time they get things really moving and going, they suddenly get shut down because of moisture, and and then have a late start the following day. So it's kind of been a long, slow go so far.
Before we talk about the results to the moment, anyway, on harvest there, what were the general expectations going in as far as the likely output?
Yeah, prior to, everybody had was pretty optimistic about what they were going to see. They were expecting some high yields. Things were really looking good. We had some good stands here late, a lot of late tillering that was adding a little bit, and a lot of good-looking wheat throughout the area that folks were pretty excited about, and some of them even getting an early start where there was some green straw. I heard some reports early on. There were some guys that were cutting a little bit of green straw, but the grain was dry. They were 9-10% on moisture on the samples they were taking in, so they were trying to go ahead and cut. So they were pretty excited to get in there and get it out of the way. And you don't ever want to grumble about moisture, but I think there are a few guys that would just soon let it hold off for just a couple more days before we see any more.
Well, we'll find out what the prospects for that are when we visit very shortly here with K-State's Mary Knapp on the weather outlook. But for the wheat that has been brought in, how have the test weights and yields looked?
Everything that's coming in so far, for the most part, has been pretty good. Test weights early on, I was hearing anywhere from 61, 64, had a few isolated reports. I think I had one that even had gone up to 66 on test weights, so things were looking good there. Yields were anywhere from right around 50 to 80 bushel wheat, so a lot of good wheat in the area. And then on the test weights since then have dropped a point or two, and expecting to drop even lower as we kind of stretch things out and continue to fight the moisture levels. And the delayed harvest or stretch out harvest that we're facing now, we're just expecting some lower numbers going forward, at least on the test weight side. Hopefully we don't have too much lay down on them, and that folks can get out of the field and still get some of their high yield numbers that, they were pretty excited for prior to.
All in all, though, Chris, with a few adversities here, it sounds like your producers are pretty well content with how things are going to go or have gone.
Yeah, they've been fairly content, like you said. They, with things being delayed here and there, they're getting a little more disgruntled, I guess, than what they would like to, especially when they started out. But I think overall, folks don't want to grumble too much because it has turned out with a decent harvest so far, at least as far as yields go.
Chris, thanks for the quick look at harvest progress in your district. Appreciate it as always.
You bet. Thanks.
Chris Long is the agricultural agent in the Walnut Creek Extension District. Again, that is Rush, Ness, and Lane counties, toward the west central part of Kansas. To close out this segment, this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Here's Marcia Boswell.
Milling industry representatives from across sub-Saharan Africa received a virtual peek at the 2021 Kansas wheat harvest during a June 24th virtual trade team. The event was moderated by Aaron Harries, Vice President of Research and Operations for Kansas Wheat, and held in cooperation with U.S. Wheat Associates and the Nebraska Wheat Board. Each year, about half of the Kansas wheat crop is exported, emphasizing the importance of informational exchanges like this webinar for keeping current and future customers informed on crop progress, condition, and trade flows. Approximately 45 milling industry representatives from throughout the sub-Saharan African region attended the virtual event, including Nigeria, South Africa, Tanzania, Mozambique, Uganda, and Liberia. According to Justin Gilpin, Kansas Wheat CEO, there is a bond that our farmers hold with customers in the sub-Saharan African region, sharing as much information as possible directly with buyers early and often during the Kansas wheat harvest is a priority for us. Chad Wygand, U.S. Wheat Associates Regional Director for Sub-Saharan Africa, based in Cape Town, South Africa, said the virtual format has allowed U.S. Wheat Associates to expand market and crop updates to more participants from more countries across the region. Wygand said these webinars are much appreciated by our buyers. While webinars can't fully replace in-person visits, this has been one of the advantages of the webinars, getting a greater number of participants from multiple countries throughout the region that might not have been able to go on a trade team. Justin Gilpin and Royce Shaneman, executive director of the Nebraska Wheat Board, provided insights on the Kansas and Nebraska wheat crops, respectively. Kansas State University's wheat extension specialist Romulo Lolato walked through the 2021 growing season and its impacts on the 2021 Kansas hard red winter wheat crop, while Eric Sperber, the general manager CEO of Cornerstone Ag in Colby, discussed the 2021 hard white wheat crop and specific market logistics for hard white wheat exports. Matt Murphy, wheat line manager with The Andersons, Inc., provided insights on the U.S. and global grain trade situation. With a combine unloading into a grain cart on the go in the background, Tyler Ediger, a Kansas wheat farmer from Meade, joined in for a live discussion from the harvest field. Wygand said it's giving some of our contacts who may not be very familiar with U.S. wheat greater knowledge about the variety of wheat classes and qualities the United States can provide. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. And this is Agriculture Today. Next up for you on Agriculture Today, our weekly get-together with K-State Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp. She's over from the Weather Data Library to discuss the latest on Kansas agricultural weather. And you have some preliminary now, Mary, June numbers on our rainfall and on our temperatures. What are the general trends in both instances?
Well, in general, June wasn't a particularly wet month, although we did have substantial rains on the last day of the month. It didn't make up for the entire month. Statewide, we averaged just under 3 inches of rain, which was just under 70% of what we would normally get. There was one division that was above average for the month of June, and that is the Southeast. They averaged 6.67 inches, which was 115% of normal. It should be noted, however, that the distribution of the rain in southeastern Kansas was not nearly so favorable as in the western parts of the state. In western Kansas, the rainfalls were not as abundant as they were in the southeast, but they came in timely increments and at timely intervals, so that actually they're benefiting fairly well from a wet start to the year. And indeed, the Northwest is running over 100% of normal for the year to date. The only divisions that are not running normal for the year to date are the South Central and the Northeast, and both of those are over 90% of their normal rainfall. So it's no surprise that we don't have much in the way of any form of drought on the current U.S. drought monitor. And
in fact, the only quote, hot spots on that monitor this week are, as you mentioned, those locations, South Central and parts of North Central Kansas.
Well, the northern part is bordering between North Central and Northeastern Kansas. Okay. That is abnormally dry, as is that pocket in the border between Southeast and South Central Kansas. And again, both of those are abnormally dry. And it should be noted that these do not include any of the rains that fell after Tuesday morning. And as we know, eastern Kansas at least saw abundant amounts of rain in that particular period.
Let's talk more about that. This has been fairly widespread.
Right. There are pockets that have not seen as much as others, but there have been many locations, again, as you noted, in west central, northwest Kansas, where they've seen over an inch of rain. That is slowing harvest for those that are trying to get their winter wheat out, but it has been beneficial for the most part for the fall harvested crops like corn, soybeans, sorghum. So it's more problematic in the eastern parts of the state where the excess of rain has caused some flooding. There are some fields that are fully inundated. We'll have to see. This break in the weather that we're expecting for the next couple of days will be welcome in that. We've got a lot of corn in the eastern and southern part of the state that is approaching tassel, and some of it is already tasseled. So the break in the warm temperatures that we saw in the middle of June has also been welcome.
Mm-hmm. And that break has been extended through this past week as well, and we've talked about the stress on livestock. That was eased considerably the last several days.
Right. The last several days, our temperatures are ranging from 1 to about a half degree cooler than normal. The East Central actually came in at exactly normal, but that is quite a break from last week where we were running about 6 to 10 degrees warmer than normal. Humidity levels were still elevated, but not to the threshold that was the extreme danger that we'd seen earlier in June. So yes, that has been a welcome break. We're looking at a couple of dry days for the holiday weekend, but the humidity levels are still supposed to be fairly moderate. So we're looking for lows in our lower to mid 60s, which will be quite comfortable. Highs are expected to begin to push the 90-degree mark again, but 90 degrees is a typical high for July, so it won't be excessive heat, certainly not like they're seeing in the northern plains or along the Pacific Northwest, where 100-plus readings have plagued their area for an extended period of time now.
And will that weekend forecast essentially hold for the rest of next week as well, then?
We'll get a chance for some rain into next week, but at this point, the QPF, the quantitative precip forecast, doesn't suggest that that's going to be particularly abundant. We're looking at generally a quarter to a half an inch of rain. Again, given the areas that have seen as much rain as we did in this last week, that's not going to be unwelcome. Having a dry period maybe allow for getting back into the field, get some of those wheat fields harvested, maybe get some of the pesticide treatments done would be certainly on the welcome side. And if we can keep those humidity levels down so we don't move into the stress level on the livestock, that will also be welcome. And again, as we've noted, corn is moving into the tasseling phase, the silking phase. We don't want to have an extended period of hot weather to compromise ear set and kernel set. We would like a nice week of moderate temperatures to keep that going.
Without triple-digit readings, that's for sure. And you've fresh in hand the updated outlook for the month of July. And how's it looking?
Right. They updated that on the 30th of June, and that is kind of a neutral outlook for us. It's looking at equal chances for above or below normal temperatures and equal chances for above or below normal precipitation. Interestingly, they've got a wet signal to our south from the desert southwest of Arizona, New Mexico, across Texas and Oklahoma, and just edging into the southern part of Kansas, which gives us some degree of hope that we would have a normal summer pattern ourselves.
Yeah, leaves the door open for spillover moisture to our direction, and let's look for that.
Right. Certainly from the monsoons in the southwest, and also a fairly active hurricane season, which can take the form of some dissipating tropical systems moving into Kansas.
We'll monitor it as always. Mary, we appreciate your time and the input. Enjoy your holiday weekend.
You as well.
Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. We will be away on Monday for the Independence Day weekend, so please rejoin us right here on Tuesday. Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a happy and safe 4th. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.